Dr. Bonnie Nish, Executive Director of Word Vancouver. I want to welcome you to our first ever Hybrid Festival. We're thrilled this year to be back in person after 2 long years of being online. We're hopeful that you're going to find the diverse programming that we've set out for you be something that you can find something of enjoyment, something that will educate you, something you can have fun with, bring your family to, bring a book to, and wander around and meet all kinds of authors. We want to also take a moment to thank all those sponsors who make this possible every year. The Canada Arts Council, Canada Book Fund, Canada Periodical Fund, Canada Heritage Fund, BC Gaming, Joseph Walks Foundation, the Hamver Foundation, DVBIA, and so many more. We also want to thank Penguin Random House for coming on board to make sure that we could have ASL interpreters on site this year as well. Please stop by, bring a book, find a book, say hello, and enjoy the day.
Hi there, my name is Dave Seaweed, and I'm the Indigenous Coordinator at Douglas College. I am from the Kwakiutl Nation, born and raised in East Vancouver. My father and his father before him are from Port Hardy in Alert Bay. I would like to acknowledge that I'm sharing with you today on the Kakite First Nation, which is the newest Minster band, and thank Chief Rhonda Larrabee for supporting our work at Douglas College. As is my understanding, the Word Vancouver Festival spread throughout the Lower Mainland and Fraser Valley and online throughout North America and beyond. I would also acknowledge the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, Kwantlen, Katzie, and Coquitlam nations. We acknowledge that we are on the unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish people, where we live, we learn, we play, and we do our work. 95% of British Columbia, including Vancouver, is on unceded traditional First Nations territory. Unceded means that First Nations people never ceded or legally signed away their lands or gave them away to the Crown or to Canada. I have been asked why we acknowledge First Nations territory. Many organizations, governments, and school districts have adopted the practice of acknowledging traditional territories as a way to honor and show respect to the Aboriginal inhabitants of this land, the First Peoples. This practice enables wider municipal communities to share in Aboriginal cultures and leads to better relationships and understandings. Observing this practice connects participants with the traditional territory and provides a welcoming atmosphere to the land where people are gathering. We believe that acknowledging territory is a positive step towards reconciliation, which involves a commitment to learning about and understanding the real history of Canada's Aboriginal peoples and taking responsibility for reconciliation with Aboriginal peoples in Canada. The process of reconciliation is tied to the federal government's relationship with Indigenous peoples. The term has come to describe attempts made by individuals and institutions to raise awareness about colonization and its ongoing effects on Indigenous peoples. I would encourage you all, young and old, to do a little research about where you live, work, or go to school, and in turn, find out what First Nations territory you are on, so you can acknowledge when asked or for sharing at events. I wanted to conclude by mentioning the September 30th national holiday that began last year as National Day for Truth and Reconciliation on September 30th. In First Nations communities, we have been honoring Orange Shirt Day since 2013. The origins for the day come from a story about Phyllis Webstad's experience. She went to the mission for one school year in 73 and 74. She had just turned 6 years old and lived with her grandmother on the Dog Creek Reserve. They never had very much money, but somehow her grandmother managed to buy her a new outfit to go to the mission school. She remembers going to the store, picking out a shiny orange shirt. It had string laced up in front and was so bright and exciting, just like she felt to be going on to school. When she got to the mission, they took away her clothes, including the orange shirt. She never wore it again. She didn't understand why they wouldn't give it back to her. The color orange has always reminded her of that and how her feelings didn't matter, how no one cared, and how she felt like she was worth nothing. All of the little children were crying and nobody cared. We now wear orange shirts that always say, "Every child matters." I would encourage you all to wear orange shirts on September 30th and become an ally and partner for First Nations folks dealing with the residential school findings. I'm wishing you all the best during your time with Word Vancouver 2022. Stay strong and stay safe. Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're tuning in from, and welcome to this conversation with the editors of the anthology Tongues on Longing and Belonging Through Language. My name is Taslim Jaffer, and I'm a writer, editor, and writing instructor, and I live on the unceded and traditional territories of the Kwantlen, Katsi, and Semiahmoo nations, and this is where I have the privilege of living, working, and raising my children. It is my pleasure to host this event. These women, this book, and this topic are so close to my heart. And the last time that I shared a screen with these three editors was actually at the book launch for Tongues that took place last year. This book is put out by Book Hug Press, and I'm so excited to hear how things have been going. But before we get started, just a little bit of housekeeping. Those of you in the audience will notice that you don't have access to your camera or your mic, but you can still be part of this conversation by participating in the chat. And we do hope to hear from you. We'd love to hear where you are tuning in from and any appreciation you have for what the editors are saying. And we would especially love to hear any questions. We are going to have a Q&A section later on in the hour. So please drop your questions in the chat at any time that they pop up, and we will be sure to get to them later on. I also want to remind you that you can purchase this book, Tongues, and any of the other books that you hear about throughout the festival from our sponsor bookstore, Iron Dog Books. You can also support the festival through our silent auction and the donate button on the website, and all of those links are going to be dropped into the chat. This is a free festival, and it is free because of help from people like you. So thank you very much. Before we launch into this conversation, it's my pleasure to introduce you to the editors. I will read their bios. I'm going to talk about Ayelet first. Ayelet Tsabari was born in Israel to a large family of Yemeni descent. She is the author of the memoir and essays, The Art of Leaving, winner of the Canadian Jewish Literary Award for Memoir, finalist for the Writers' Trust Hilary Weston Prize and the Vine Awards, and an Apple Books and Kirkus Review Best Book of 2019. Her first book, The Best Place on Earth, won the Sammy Rohr Prize for Jewish Literature and the Edward Lewis Wallant Award, and was longlisted to the Frank O'Connor International Short Story Award. The book was a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice, a Kirkus Review Best Book of 2016, and has been published internationally. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, the Globe and Mail, Foreign Policy, The Forward, and the National Post. She teaches creative writing at the University of King's College MFA in Creative Nonfiction and at Bar Ilan University. Eufemia Fantetti is a graduate of the Writer Studio at Simon Fraser University and holds an MFA in creative writing from the University of Guelph. Her short story collection, A Recipe for Disaster and Other Unlikely Tales of Love, was runner-up for the Danuta Gleed Literary Award and winner of the F.G. Bressani Prize. She is a winner of the Event Magazine Nonfiction Contest and a 3-time winner of the annual Acenti Writing Contest. Her writing has been listed as notable in the Best American Essay Series. My Father, Fortune Tellers, and Me, a Memoir, was released in 2019. She teaches at Humber College and the University of Guelph-Humber and co-edits the Humber Literary Review. Leonarda Carranza was born in El Salvador and currently resides in Brampton, Ontario, part of the Treaty Lands and Territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. She is the author of Abuelita and Me. She holds a PhD in social justice education from the University of Toronto. She is the winner of Briar Patch Magazine's Writing in the Margins contest and Room's 2018 Short Forms contest. Welcome to our 3 editors this morning. Hello. So lovely to see you.
So lovely to be here with you. Thank you.
Yeah. So before we jump into our conversation, I just want to share a little bit about the book with the audience for anyone who hasn't had a chance to pick it up yet. I have it here, and I'm going to just read a little bit from the back, just snippets of the blurb. In this collection of deeply personal essays, 26 writers explore their connection with language, accents, and vocabularies, and contend with the ways these can be used as both bridge and weapon. Some explore the way power and privilege affect language learning. Some confront the pain of losing a mother tongue or an ancestral language, and others celebrate the joys of learning a new language and the power of connection. Tongues on Longing and Belonging Through Language is a vital anthology that opens a compelling dialogue about language diversity and probes the importance of language in our identity and the ways in which it shapes us. So let's continue that important dialogue on this screen today. Obviously, each of you has a relationship with language. I mean, we all do. But you have thought so deeply about your language and your relationship to it that you decided to put this book together. So before we talk about it as a whole, I would love to hear what each of your relationship is with language. Eufemia, would you like to go first with this one?
Sure, Taslim. Thanks for doing this again. I don't want to be cheeky, but it's complicated. It's like that status, it's complicated. So it's an emotional relationship to language. The first language that I learned was an ancestral language, and it's a dialect, so it doesn't have a dictionary where I can go look things up. And part of the process of working on this anthology and coming together on this anthology was that I'd read something that Ayelet had forwarded me from Leonarda, and it was recognizing that I wanted to delve deeper into my own relationship with language and how I saw my parents being treated because they spoke English with an accent. So it's a love relationship with the topic of language, and then getting deeper into the what's the power dynamic when there's a standard language and there's a dialect, and how are people treated. And so this gave me the opportunity to really work with other writers and 2 wonderful editors that I admire and adore to really go deep into that.
Okay, great. Thank you. Leonarda, would you like to share your relationship?
Sure, thank you. Yes, I think I've been thinking about this for a long time, and partly this is because I came to Canada as an immigrant, as a child, and then had the experience of having to learn a language. Like I had to learn English, and some of that early experiences were shaped by feeling ridiculed and made fun of because of the accent that I had, and as a child, feeling kind of like really disoriented in terms of having to learn a language, but also seeing my mom, the person that, before coming here was like completely competent, someone I could rely on, and then having her have to rely on us to translate for her because she didn't get access to, learn the language the way that we did. So I think those early experiences really shaped me, and they left this like lifelong interest in language learning, like the way that we learn language, but also the barriers and the kind of impact that they have on people, the way they just they can leave somebody out where they don't feel like they can talk to other people without being asked to repeat themselves, or they don't feel included in conversations. And so, yeah, I think that the first essay I actually wrote was about those experiences, and it was titled Tongues. And so that title became an inspiration for the anthology. But it's also something that I continued to look at in my studies. When I was doing my PhD, I interviewed a lot of people who talked about their experiences of being shamed in school, and then completely felt disconnected from writing. And I just thought that was like heartbreaking, and the lifelong impact that has. Like I heard recently someone he was interviewing for a career that was like, his dream. And in the interview, they asked him to write a short paragraph about why he wanted to work there. And he just walked out, because what he had learned from schooling here was that writing was not for him. And it's just heartbreaking how many people learned that. So it was something that I'm still interested in. And yeah, that's why I really wanted to work on this anthology.
Great, thank you. Yeah, it's really coming through already from both of what you're saying, how language can be used as weapon. And, we're so emotionally connected to language because it's how we express who we are. And when there's barriers to that, it comes through in so many situations. So, yeah. Ayelet?
Thank you. It's so good to be here and to spend time with all of you. Leonarda speak about her mother, because I think of how little I knew my grandma, growing up, and how distant she was from me because we didn't have a common language. And even more so, to be brutally honest, is and looking back now at the child I was, I could see that I had some judgment toward her. You know what I mean? I think I internalized some of that, this awful thinking that was instilled in us about people who have accents, about people who don't, who can't speak the language that well. So it took me a really long time to find a way back to her when I was older, and through appreciation of my ancestral tongue and wanting to reclaim it, and realizing that if I want to connect with her, this is the way. And I'm really grateful that I managed to do that, because by the time I did that, it was quite late, and she was very old. And we managed to have this like beautiful connection in the last, just before she died, in the few years before she died. And I'm so grateful that I managed, to find that bridge between us. But I think in general, I've always been interested in language. I think, most as a writer, like a kid who read incessantly, and wrote, language was fascinating to me. And I said like appreciation for my ancestral tongue, but I think that also came from becoming an immigrant myself. And then moving to Canada and suddenly being so humbled by being that person, being that person who has an accent, who doesn't speak well, who doesn't know the right words, who uses some words wrong. And I had the experiences of being mocked. I'll never forget those moments where people, just literally made fun of me for not knowing a word in college. You don't know what that means, like, oh my God, Ayelet doesn't know what that means. And I'm like, or using a word wrong, and I think that's where it came from. So if I'm backtracking now, that's what I think led me back to my grandmother, because suddenly I had an appreciation for what she's been through, because I came to Canada, I had some English. She came to Israel with no Hebrew at all. So that's so, I can't even imagine that level of alienation. you know. So all of that, you know, living in a new language and facing my own judgment, facing my own internalized, you know, bigotry, you know, all of that, I think, is what made me really want to work on this anthology with this awesome women.
Oh, thank you. Oh, Ayelet, you know, when you were talking about your grandma, I got a lump in my throat because one of the things I remembered was my 5th birthday party. We had it at McDonald's. We lived in Victoria. So we'd been in Canada for about 4 years, and my grandmother came with us from Kenya, and she was living with us at the time. And she came to McDonald's for the birthday party, and she saw me fooling around with my friends, and we weren't eating. So she kept saying to us, cow, cow, which means like eat, eat. And my friends were like, why is she saying cow? Why is she, you know, like the animal? And I was so mad at my grandmother, and I told her, like, don't talk to me in front of my friends. And, you know, that now, you know, looking back, like, oh, that's painful because, you know, I didn't mean to hurt her feelings, but at the time I just wanted to belong and I didn't want to be embarrassed. And so, yeah, there's so much wrapped up in that. Yeah, so thanks for reminding me about that, Ayelet. No, I'm just no, but it's so like what I'm saying is that there's so many of us who've been in that situation, and you know, there's this expression that it's like you shouldn't make fun of somebody with broken English because it probably means they know like 2 or 3 other languages, right? Like, and it's something that we haven't quite grasped, I don't think. Like, we still look down on people who are, you know, have some broken English or are using words incorrectly. Like, yet it means that they, you know, this is probably, English might be like their 3rd or 4th language that they're learning, right? So, and it's not an easy one to learn too.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, to add to that, like, it's the stories moving, Taslim, that you just shared, because it's I don't think anybody gets away from the dominant power structure, the fact that this is the language of the colonizer, the fact that we want to be, if you're writing in the language that you want to be read, and the complications of the systemic barriers, like this story that Leonarda shared about, that keeps happening, and that we all had stories of, like, we all connected over the, like, desire to be writers and the desire to, like, be great at craft, but also we'd all had incidences that we understood shaming from whatever aspect. We'd witnessed it, we'd been part of it, and that you can't get away from, like, that, the having to acknowledge the bigger dynamic that's at play there. You know, I think it was only in the last year Ayelet shared a story that I'd never heard before, and I've known her for years. But it was that kind of thing of, like, when people are mocking someone with an accent, or you know, there was a comedian in the 80s who used to do this joke that was, you know, people say, you're in America now, you got to speak American. And his response was, I don't think that's Cherokee that you're speaking. So it was like acknowledging, like, there's a language to the land that we live on that we're disconnected from. And there's a language loss, and there's a, you know, and anybody who's going to be like, what's that mean, is really not looking at the bigger picture of people. You can't, you know, there's a failure of learning French in this country, you know? So, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to add, it just made me think about, like, when we talk about accents, like, everyone has an accent.
Yes.
You know, and it's just that what we don't talk about is that there's this hierarchy, like what you were talking about, Eufemia. There's this kind of like this sense that we all have to come here and we all have to learn to speak a particular way. And if you don't, then in some ways you're a failure and you're less. And that gives, you know, space for people to make fun of you or put you down. When it's like completely, you know, not possible, you know, we can't all speak the same way.
And every language has it. Like Italian has it. Every language has its own version of, this is what an articulate, educated person sounds like. Everybody else we're going to ignore. And that, I think, we really got to see in some of the contributor stories too. The language loss, the grief, the, you know, the connections.
Yeah, and then, so you took all of these these separate relationships you have with language, but you brought it together to come up with this idea of this anthology. Is there a special way that it came together? Like, how did you dream this up?
Ayelet. it's Ayelet that it's the 6 degrees of Ayelet.
Tell me more about that.
No, not really, actually. Like, Leonarda had an idea for an anthology that was a similar topic, but not quite. And she talked to me about it, and I was like, yeah, sure, I can contribute, I can help. But then I kept thinking about something else that I've spoken to Eufemia about before, which is the idea of writers who write in their second language and so on. And then one day, I suddenly just clued in that maybe those two ideas are one idea that could be more, just larger and wider, because it was, both of the ideas were a little narrower. Mm-hmm. So I called both of them very excitedly, and I said, I think it's one idea. I think it's one book. And they both agreed immediately, and that's kind of how it came together. But it's interesting because, like, yeah, we've all sort of walked with it for a while, we gestated for a while before it suddenly, there was like this aha moment that it could all,
just
work.
like I said, I yell it. Because we all had our own particular obsessions with it. Like, mine was witnessing people being shamed for their accents, and so it was like, that's why Leonarda's essay spoke to me, and we knew we wanted that to be the title. We were just like, yes, when Ayelet connected all the dots and was the community like builder that she is, it was like, this is where it really picked up steam, and we were able to also spend some time working with contributors like yourself and reading these wonderful stories, like people's connection to language.
Yeah, so tell me about that, about bringing in other writers to this anthology. Like, what were some of the joys and challenges of that process?
I think part of it is like the biggest thing was that we got to work on this during the pandemic. And like we say that in the collective essay, so, like, while everything's shutting down, we're getting these beautiful essays popping up, that are making us think about language in such different ways. I know that, initially one of our worries was that because we've been so committed to what we've been thinking about for so long, we thought we're just going to get 26 essays writing the exact same thing, over and over again. And so we were, that's one of the things that we were worried about. And then what a surprise. No. And it was like, every time we got one, it's like, oh, I love this one. And just like deepening the conversation that we've been having.
So then how did you work together to kind of put all of this together? Like, there must have been some kind of challenges that came through.
The surprises we've had is that it was actually kind of a smooth sailing. Like, I know I've spoken to other people who've edited anthologies, and they said, yeah, it's not easy. You have to like work with other people, usually another editor, one or two, and meet weekly. We spoke weekly. We had Zoom chats. We had a WhatsApp group. We had all of it. We tried every possible, media that one can try. But we worked really well together. Like, we agreed on most things. When one of us was really swamped with life, the other two took over. It just felt really like it was the bright spot in a very difficult time for everyone, and I think we were so lucky. It feels like it saved us, to go back to the work and to have those weekly sessions with one another. But yeah, it was surprisingly just an incredible experience. Like, when it ended, I was like, oh no,
Mhm.
Now what are we gonna do?
Yeah, it was a real anchor.
Another one.
Yeah, it was an
Yeah.
anchor during a difficult, like during a tempestuous time, for sure, for all of us.
Well, the product is certainly seamless. I mean, it's such a joy to read each essay. And when I first read the essays through, it took me a while to get through it because I would read one and then I have to sit with it. Like each one is really powerful. And in Ayelet, I can see what you mean about, making the topic a bit broader because there is so much you can say about language and there's so much covered in this book. So yeah, the product is just seamless and gorgeous. So congratulations. I would love to invite a reading at this time. Eufemia, are you okay to read first?
Sure.
I think we would
Yeah.
all love to hear a little bit about this, some of the readings from the book. So,
All right. So I'll be reading from my essay, 5 Stages of Language Loss. As a teenager, I imagined traveling the world with a steam trunk that would be stamped and stickered with the names of cities: Tokyo, Madrid, Paris, and Berlin. I bought Spanish and German Berlitz phrase books and tried to teach myself rudimentary conversation, but there was no one to converse with and my enthusiasm flickered out. I struggled with the drill and grill approach to learning French in high school and signed up for a 6-week summer immersion in Chicoutimi. I arrived in the Saguenay region of Quebec, eager to improve and thrilled to have escaped my violent home. At 18, I'd been studying the language since grade 3, almost 10 years. Even after all those hours in French class, I could merely carry on basic chit-chat. If asked to conjugate a regular verb or give basic feedback on the weather while walking along the Champs-Élysées, pas de problème. In Chicoutimi, I wasn't allowed to parler anglais. Parfait, I thought. This was exactly what I needed. On a phone call home, I tried to describe the bucolic surroundings to my father without using any English. The place was famous for its blueberry harvest. Italian dialect mashed with low-level French ability in my mind and mouth as I tried to tell him about my day. My dad didn't know French. He couldn't understand my garbled words, and the resulting conversation was disastrous. But I remained determined to succeed. I stopped, started, and mentally retraced my steps several times. Mid-conversation, I was hunched over and rubbing my right temple as I gripped the receiver. I went to the lag, I said, forgetting the word for lake in Italian. I used French again, hoping the word was a cognate that would smooth over my inability to switch between the two Romance languages. My father was confused. Ulat? You was go for milk? This is what my father heard next, shouted in Italian. Be serious. How could I go to the milk? I didn't say the milk. I said the milk. Toronto is on Milk, Ontario. We go for walks along the milk all the time. I had a headache after hanging up. One morning, 4 weeks in, I woke up triumphant from a dream where I'd spoken in French. I was jubilant. Unlike my classroom experiences back in Toronto, I valued being corrected by the instructor or by José, the woman I was billeted with. There was an atmosphere of encouragement that wiped out my embarrassment over mistakes. Returning to grade 13 that fall, I was excited about my marked improvement until the instructor chastised my speech and oral presentations, demanding I use the French they spoke in France. I tried to argue, in French, that it was more likely I'd be communicating with someone from Montreal than Paris, but after Madame ridiculed my picked-up pronunciation patterns, I stopped participating. Pas de plaisir. In acquiring French, I thought I could distance myself from everything I hated about being Italian. The brutal arguments, constant criticism, and heavily adorned in golden crucifixes, damnation, and hellfire of the whole kit and caboodle that I called home. But I walked away from Francais and considered the loss a personal fait accompli failure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's lovely. Yes. That evokes a lot of emotion. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. So many people have read this book and many people have said great things about it. I just want to read a review from that was in the Quill and Choir from Shanice Jan Mohammed, who said, astonishingly consistent in caliber, Tongues on Longing and Belonging Through Language is one of the finest anthologies published in recent years and should be required reading on syllabuses across the country. What a great review. I would love to hear your thoughts on why you think she said that this should be required reading across the land. Ayelet, would you like to talk about this?
But I don't know. Like, what do you think? Like, as a reader, I feel like I just feel, funny looking of the anthology and being like, yes, it should be required reading. I'm more comfortable hearing other people saying that.
Yeah, well, I can speak to it as a reader. There were essays that made me feel like validated, that some of the struggles that I have and have had with language, other people have had them. So it makes me feel like I'm part of a community almost, or like, I'm not alone in this at least. And I would say that I was happy to have people read my essay. I wrote about the difficulties of passing down my mother tongue to my children who were born and raised here. And I was happy to know that other people would be reading it because it's a part of me that doesn't get talked about a lot. As a mom, I talk to other moms about, what do you put your kids in after school and hockey tryouts and like, what's the best, brand for this product or whatever for your kids. But one of the biggest things I carry is actually this, not burden, but like difficulty, challenge of like passing down my language. And that's not something people normally talk about, on the playground. So I was happy that people would read that. I want people to know that there are a lot of parents who struggle with this. And just because it's not common to talk about it, or maybe some people don't understand it, like they don't experience it themselves, maybe if they read this, they can see another dimension, who I am as a parent and a person. So,
yeah, I don't want to, I agree with Ayelet in terms of like, but I get cheeky in my own way because Shanice is right in her comment, like it should be required reading. I think, some of the examples that I think about, or that moving example that Leonarda gave at the beginning of someone walking away from their dream job because they couldn't write something because they'd had that happen. I think people need to examine their bias when it comes to language, and it's a conversation we never had about that power dynamic. Like it's a little bit in the atmosphere now, but I think about like that story of somebody walking away from a job, or even like I knew as a teenager I wasn't getting called because people couldn't pronounce my name, on my resume, and that even it was into my 20s and 30s where somebody said like, oh yeah, I wasn't even going to try. They ended up being my manager and someone else did. And I thought, we don't talk about that in a situation like a country like Canada where we all have different names, and that you might make a mistake in pronunciation, or you might even have trouble with the pronunciation because your tongue can't do it. But that as long as we try, then we're at least honoring something about that person and that individual and the human being. And it really does relate to our own fear of like mispronunciation, things like that. So it opens up the conversation, I think. The anthology does.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's that aspect of like honoring where people are at. Like Taslim, what you were talking about, like, that it takes a community to be able to pass on a language. It's such a huge burden when you're isolated, only have like a couple of members of your family and you're trying to pass on the language to your kids. And then, I know that when we were little, my mom made us all speak Spanish so that we could all preserve it, right? And so when my youngest brother went to school for the first time, he didn't speak English, just like the rest of us, even though he was born here. And, he was ridiculed so much for that. And, I think that's why I think this anthology needs to be read. I think that people who are in positions of power have to think about these things really delicately, about, you know, the work that people do to pass on language and how important that is for self-esteem, to feel connected to your community, and how do we facilitate that? How do we embrace that? How do we create spaces so that people know, like the little kids know there's value in, you know, having a name that is hard for other people to pronounce, but that there's value in that, and that how do we preserve those things, right?
They don't fracture their identity. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. All valid thoughts. I agree. Yeah. I just want to remind the audience too that if you have any questions for our editors here, please feel free to pop them in the chat and we'll get to them. I just want to invite Ayelet now to do her reading, if that's okay.
I'm going to read from my essay. It's titled Disappearance/Muteness. I'm going to read from the beginning. There are certain words that always come to me in Yemeni, words that appear on my tongue without effort, words that come first, before my dominant languages get a say. Yemeni Arabic, more specifically the Judeo-Arabic vernacular of North Yemen, is the dialect my grandparents spoke their whole lives and my mother and aunt still use when they sing or when they pepper their Hebrew speech with Yemeni words or quote colorful idioms like, your rib is broken when you marry off your son, you gain a rib when you marry off your daughter, or imaginative curses like, may the demons kidnap you. The language I heard every time I visited my grandmother, watching her talk with her daughters, her friends, her words accompanied with expressive hand gestures and exaggerated sighs, sounding always either mad or cheeky. A language she used for endearments, infused with the love of ancestral mothers, Hayati, Ayuni, Galbi, my life, my eyes, my heart. A language I was surrounded by every time I walked the streets of Sharia, the neighborhood in Israel where she lived and my parents grew up. A language I want to believe lies dormant in my body, genetically encoded into my cells, waiting to be awakened, activated. A language I don't speak, and now it's too late. A dying language that, despite its disappearance from the world, managed to take root in my brain in the form of stubborn words that won't let go. My grandmother never quite took to Hebrew. Arabic always came first, allowed her the range of wit and humor her adopted Hebrew never could. As most women in Yemen, she was illiterate, but in her 60s, she took Hebrew lessons and learned to sign her name instead of dipping her thumb in ink as she had done before. After her death, I found an official document in my mom's closet. My grandmother's Hebrew given name, which she also never took to, scribbled hesitantly and childlike at the bottom of the page. Like other Jewish men, knew Hebrew from prayers, but that Hebrew was biblical, sacred, not for everyday use. When they arrived in Palestine in the 1930s, Hebrew, which had been a dead language for 17 generations, became the only way these Jewish immigrants from different countries could communicate. How strange it must have felt to utter these words reserved for prayer in an everyday context, to shop in the market, to argue with a neighbor, to bring them down to earth. Many years later, when I came to Canada and had to live in a new language, a language I learned in school but scored a D+ on my matriculation exam, a language that felt unnatural and awkward in my mouth, its long and short syllables like a minefield designed to make me trip. Don't say bitch when you mean beach, I prayed every time a visit to Kit's Beach was mentioned. I thought of my grandparents. This is an essay about my longing for Arabic, but it is also an essay written in English by someone who was born into Hebrew, who didn't know English until she was 10, who hadn't read an English book until she was 24, who wrote her first story in English at 33. There are days when I worry that writing in my second language is the most interesting thing about me as a writer. I understand the fascination. Writing in a second language I had written once is like wearing someone else's skin, an act akin to religious conversion. This isn't what this essay is about, but how can I ignore that part of my story, that facet of my writerly identity? Hebrew and Arabic, and so it's no surprise that words in these languages demand to be included. They migrate into the English text, unitalicized, and assert their place in the foreign settings, mirroring my own story of immigration. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Ayelet. Thanks so much for sharing that. I am so curious because I haven't spoken to you as a group since Tongues came out last year, and I would love to know what kind of response you have been getting personally. I mean, I read reviews and talked to people who've read the book myself, but I'm curious to know, what have you been hearing?
I have to say that recently I found, like, I don't even remember now if it was Goodreads or something. I found something, like a new thing. I'm sorry, I was going to send it to Eufemia and Leonarda. I'll look for it, and I was like blown away by the comments. I was really, really moved to see how much people were moved. I think it was Goodreads. It was just like some readers that commented on it. I just somehow I avoid Goodreads because apparently it's not for authors, it's for readers. But I stumbled upon it, and it was like, it's really, it means a lot to seeing how many people connect with it. It's shocking. I think I didn't expect that wide of a response.
And I can't remember if it was you or Leonardo who sent the link from CBC when it was happening on CBC. I know I was out doing errands, and then it was like, it's being talked about on CBC, and I was like, amazing, and I've had just a few people at the college that I work at have been like, oh, that they picked it up and they read it. It shouldn't, like, I shouldn't have that reaction of shock, but I'm always like, it's been lovely to see it so well received by people who like coming from other languages too. Like, yes, I could see more tongues and see more, like, because there's been waves of immigration and refugees and all of that. So it was just, it's heartwarming. It's a soul bomb, honestly, to see this subject that has been an obsession for a long time. First, it was like, like when you meet unicorns, to be like, oh, you're obsessed with this too? Me too, with Leonarda and Ayelet. And then you're like, oh, thank goodness, But then it was like, oh, there's like, it's not just these two unicorns. It's a stampede of unicorns. They're all over the place. So it feels
what an image.
Yeah, I know, right? But I guess because such a vital part of some of this, the conversations I'm having these days, is what it's felt like to not see yourself reflected in literature, when you never existed in the books that you escaped into as a character, as a person from your background, with your ancestry. I think the first time I read something where someone had that kind of the same background as me, I was in my 20s, and by then I was already invisible. I was already trying to write literature with a capital L. So it's been really wonderful to just have that experience of being like, oh, everybody's hungry for these stories. It wasn't just me wishing they existed. Everybody, like, has been very welcoming, and that's been, it's meant so much.
Yeah, and it's earned some bling, hasn't it?
It has.
The last little while, yeah.
Yes.
So yeah, I just want to say thank you for the lovely comments in the comment section. So I just want to make sure the editors can see them as well. It's really nice to hear about your personal experiences with writing and with language. I would like to invite Leonarda to do her reading now.
So my essay is titled Lengua Materna, and I'm just going to be reading from a middle section. Um, English was hard for Mom, who had chosen to study German in high school and who, unlike most of her classmates, never dreamt of migrating to the US nor imagined herself living in Canada. When we first arrived, she took English classes out of necessity, not out of some aspiration to one day read English literature or watch Canadian films, not out of an interest in possessing English or being possessed by it, and not because she was falling in love with a new country. English was a means to access work, and she was lucky. Her first English teacher was kind and treated her like a friend. But like most working, poor, racialized women, Mom's time for schooling in those early years was cut short. We needed money, and it wasn't long before she was forced to start working. She was offered a job that required very little English competency and where she worked for 8 hours a day on an assembly line making antennas. It would be more than a decade before she would take another English class. One summer, when I was in my 30s, Mom told me for the first time how insecure she still feels in English. Even after so many years of living in Canada, she still feels like English does not belong to her. She told me how she always wanted at least one of us to partner with someone who spoke Spanish. You don't know how hard it is, she told me, while we sat in her backyard. Mom stared right at me with such intensity. The heaviness of needing to feel understood and at ease in language imprinted itself into the memory of that day. None of us did find Spanish-speaking partners, and sadly, this isn't the only way Mom feels left out or excluded. At family gatherings, my siblings and I may start off talking in Spanish, but inevitably drift into English. It takes us a while to register that Mom isn't participating. Sometimes she interrupts us and asks us to explain something. Sometimes she leaves the room without us noticing. One day she called to ask me how to tell the plumber that the pipe was leaking. It reminded me how much she still needs us to find the right words. As a child, my mother often relied on me to translate. I hated the responsibility. I hated the proximity to adults and their conversations. All I wanted was for Mom to hurry up and learn so she could do it herself. I didn't realize that Mom was forced to work, and the work that was available to her perpetuated a lack of access to time, energy, and money necessary to learn a new language. Try working an 8 hour shift in a factory, traveling more than 2 hours each way, and then coming home to make dinner, and then grocery shop on weekends and do laundry and clean a house, and see where you can fit language learning into your day. Mom spent her time isolated while the rest of us went to school, made friends, and started to plant roots in this country. So while we were busy learning a new language, she was left behind. When we were children, my siblings and I were not allowed to speak English at home. This forced us to keep speaking Spanish, although we often ran upstairs into our rooms to speak secretly in English. I always thought this was my father's role. I thought he was so committed to preserving our Latinx identity and our connection to the Spanish language that he insisted we speak only Spanish in the house. It's only recently that I learned that it was Mom who created this rule to help us preserve the language. For the first few years in Canada, we thought we were only going to stay until the war ended. We couldn't have known that the war would take 12 years and that when it was finally over, we'd feel like there was no place to go back to. Mom lost 2 brothers in the war. One brother was taken by the military and tortured. Her youngest was killed and left on the side of the road. Her father and sister died while we were living in Canada, and the home we had in El Salvador was taken from us, stolen by a relative who took advantage of our situation. Almost everyone she loved was taken from her. For Mom, learning English came with the necessity and urgency to find work, to feed and house our family. It also came with the guilt of leaving family and community behind, and then the grief of losing them. It came with feeling left out and being pushed down and ridiculed. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Leonarda. All of your readings were so beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing. And I know it's probably enticing people to go and buy the anthology and read the rest of your essays and the others that are in there. So just a reminder that Iron Dog Books is our sponsor for this festival, and they're a local independent bookstore, Indigenous and women-owned. So we would love for you to show some support there. And just before we wrap things up, because I can't believe we're coming to the top of the hour already, you have started a great conversation in book form, I think, with this anthology. This conversation is carried on Zoom and on meetings such as this, and in your conversations with others. Where would you like to see this conversation going? This conversation about language diversity, like where would you like to see it go? What topics can would you like to see?
Well, I'm actually I'm actually thinking physically where it could be going. It makes me think about, what Shanice Jan Mohammed wrote about it being, required reading. I want to see it become more centrally positioned. I want to see it being spoken in schools. I want to see, you feeling comfortable to talk about that loss in everyday setting. I don't want it to be relegated, to it is a big part of Canada, of this place, well, that's not where I am at right now, but you know what I'm saying? Like it's, so it should be spoken more widely and more centrally. And on a personal note, I would have loved to continue and publish a second book about this, because there's just so much more. There's so much more that we left out, that we didn't have the time or the space, or there's so much more still.
I'm sure there's volumes to be written and shared.
Exactly.
Let's hope that there can be space for that at some point. Any other thoughts on where you'd like this conversation to go?
Honestly, I just agree with everything Ayelet said. And it's just, I would love for there to be even a course in, like, when you're starting in elementary school, discussing the Indigenous languages of the land and the territory that people live on, and also addressing like what happens in language and power dynamic, instead of it just being like you go to English class, you go to French class, you go to social studies. Like there needs to be this bigger conversation that's happening, because that was what happened, I think, when we started with the anthology, was you open it up and you're suddenly like, everybody has something to say about this. And like Leonarda said, we were a little bit anxious, and then suddenly it was everybody has something unique, different, even if they've all even if it's an experience of being a positive experience or a shamed experience, they all had a unique story and take that made you kind of go like, oh, we're all connected to this topic.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. We are just a couple minutes away. I've been looking at the comments, and they're wonderful. Thank you so much. I didn't see any questions, so hopefully I didn't miss anything there. But I encourage you to check out this book and have conversations amongst yourselves. And I'm sure the editors would love to hear from you as well if anything comes up when you're reading. I would also like to thank the editors for being here in all your different time zones. It's morning for me, afternoon for Eufemia and Leonarda, and evening for Ayelet. And so thanks for being here so much, making Word Vancouver a very special place to be. Thank you to all the staff and volunteers at Word Vancouver for making this possible. And there are plenty more events happening. We just kicked off the festival last night, so I hope you can check out more of the events. And Kim is asking, just how can the audience get involved? Not sure if you mean in the anthology or in the festival. If you don't mind clarifying, we just have about a minute to go.
Thanks to everyone for joining us today too.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you for your thoughtful questions and for your involvement in this project. Really
Oh,
appreciate it.
such a pleasure. Yeah, definitely an honor to be a part of it. Okay, well, I think that concludes this event. So thank you all so much for being here. Enjoy the rest of the festival. Bye.
Bye.